So, we have some milestones today, and certainly ITAPA have led the way on this Saturday by hosting yourselves here in Rome, which is absolutely fantastic. I am much happier that I am here. I believe it is raining in London. Anyway, whilst Michaela was speaking this morning, this is what was going on another side of our continent. And anyway, back to reality here. It's been a fantastic day, and so far for me, and I've learned so much. I do appreciate that I will be speaking English. Thank you to those who are able to translate and so on. But, you know, it's been a fantastic honor. So, just to take you to where I am by training a clinical psychologist. I'm an aviation psychologist as well. And I realized in coming here to Rome that some of the roots that I have enjoyed and flourished in are Italian completely. Not because I am Italian, but my training is partly Italian. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Center for the Study of the Family in Milan with Mara Salvini Palazzoli. Some of you may remember Maurizio Andolfi. These are the most important books I've ever read in psychological therapy. They continue to be so. I've worked with both groups for many years, and the main thing that I have taken away from it was about human problem solving. And that's my job. It doesn't matter if I'm working in a hospital, with pilots, with private patients, with people who have a fear of flying. Human problem solving, whether it's individuals, couples, groups, teams, amounts to often very similar things. So my roots might bring us together a little bit here. Whoa. Down. There you are. So, thank you for the introduction. Although I am wearing two hats here. One is from IAP. I am on the board of IAP and the clinical liaison. As a clinical psychologist, every single day I see pilots clinically, and I make reports sometimes to the regulators, not always to the UK CAA, sometimes to EASA, sometimes to the FAA and the US and so on. So it's quite varied. What do we do very briefly in the Center for Aviation Psychology? We are clinical psychologists. We provide mainly pilot peer support for around 30,000 pilots now. And we also develop mental health and mental well-being and resilience services, which we might touch on a bit later on. We do it in a number of different languages, and importantly, we're focusing a lot here today, I know, on civil aviation and a little bit on military, and to some extent now on space. But we mustn't forget business aviation, helicopter operators and so on, and we work extensively with them, and very often they are single-person operations and so on, which have their own kind of challenges and so on. And these are some of the AOCs that we support. Obviously, you know, there's some pretty key ones like British Airways, Aer Lingus, TAP, Virgin Atlantic, and so on. And if I can conclude, actually, not that I'm about to end my presentation now, one of the things that I've learned is that one size does not fit all, right? There is a little cliche there. Aviation psychology here and in another context or in another country or with a different AOC might have different nuances. I think that we all have sort of common threads that connect us together, but by no means do I think that, you know, we should be prescriptive about how aviation psychology should be. And I'm very proud that over several years I've been on the board of IAP. I've learned a huge amount. I've also had opportunity to come here to share some of the stuff that we're up to. That is also propagated in some work that we have done here. Some of you may be familiar. There are two textbooks that we've already published. The one on the far side came in 2017 after the Germanwings crash, which is Pilot Mental Health Assessment and Support. An amazing edited book. I can say that because I didn't write the book, I edited it. Yeah, and the book on pilot selection, ironically, came out on January 2020 as the world blew up with the pandemic. And so all of a sudden, aviation went in a different direction to what we were expecting with the book. But, you know, as we know, with the pilot shortage, hopefully that'll be resurging again. There are quite a few chapters there on mental health and well-being. For those of you interested, we're working on a new book. It'll come out next year. It'll be an IAP-sponsored publication. It's published with Hogrefer, who are one of our sponsors here today, which is fantastic. It's going to be the Handbook of Aviation Neuropsychology, so getting a little bit more specialist here, co-editing with some colleagues, one of whom is one of the FAA psychologists as well. And we're covering a wide range of different topics, some perhaps just related to what we've just heard about, hypoxia. There is toxicity issues, whether it's cockpit fumes and so on, and look at all of the other topics that we really need to capture. So this book we are currently editing. We're already looking at some of the chapters. I'm doing a chapter on air accident investigation and neuropsychology, which is a specialist interest of mine. Mental health problems are the biggest medical threat to flight safety. I didn't say that. The federal surgeon, air surgeon, said that. And she, in highlighting this, is drawing our attention to the importance of what we're doing here today. So certainly in the age group of 20 to 40 airline pilots, the major risk of mental health challenges to being grounded, having your Class 1 medical suspended, and so on. In the age group from 40 to 60 and a bit beyond, if your retirement has been pushed, we can add musculoskeletal and cardiovascular problems as well. But the main issue is mental health and well-being. And look here, we have a pilot shortage, ironically, just within a year or 18 months of sort of returning to normal flight operations. And I put this here not to be teasing or insensitive at all, but we have lots of pilots who have a lot of life left in them, and this is where we have some interest too, because as you will know, in some jurisdictions the upper reach of age will be 60 for a pilot, in others it's slightly above and up to 65, but I don't know of any jurisdictions beyond 65. The point is, there may be many pilots who probably would be absolutely competent at continuing in their work. And that's somewhere where some of our neuropsychological assessments come into play. So I've already mentioned about the grounding, and this is Rhys Simons, who's an aeromedical specialist working in the Netherlands, who has reported this data. Mental health problems are not a problem on their own, and I think this is something that we are all intuitively aware of, but the single biggest driver of a mental health problem in air crew, and I mean across the board, are these issues: shame, embarrassment, and therefore turning to secrecy and withdrawal. It's a given that in our life we will have challenges to our mental health and well-being, but the withholding of that information, the suppression of it, and so on, exacerbates it, intensifies the problem, and also can lead to difficult and bad outcomes at times. And I'm more focused these days on how we can alleviate and reduce shame and embarrassment, which I believe, as mental health professionals gathered here, is one of our primary tasks. Not just to recognize them in individuals, but to take whole communities, pilot communities, aviation communities, and to normalize this as an issue, which I believe is actually happening as we speak. None of this is unfamiliar to anyone. You all know who that is there. And, I think what is important here is to emphasize that, his training record was pretty good, not above every standard in every respect. And nobody who met with him in the time leading up had sensed that this was a likely outcome in his life, actually, including some of the medical specialists. And I say that because the immediate reaction after Germanwings to wanting to do deep psychological or psychiatric assessments made little sense, because if you want to conceal them, as we know, you can. And we have studied, not myself personally, but in mental health, we have studied suicidality, as you know, and there are several predictors of where suicide may take place, but it is very often unpredictable as well. I don't want to go into what some of those signs are here necessarily today. But we knew that that wasn't the first pilot murder suicide, and maybe not an easy slide to read in this room here, but there have been several others in the history of modern aviation if we take it back to 1982. If you look, and for those of you who are aware, and we heard about this earlier on today, the 18 months before Germanwings, there was an identical crash in Namibia, in southern Africa. Identical. And we wrote a paper which was published in a medical journal which showed that in all likelihood the Germanwings crash was a copycat. He had studied this crash and thought, I think that's what I'm going to do. So the reason that we didn't wake up, as we heard, is because it happened in Germanwings in a modern, developed society. We don't expect these things. In southern Africa, the conditions were fairly similar here. It was a pilot who had emotional distress. His employer were not going to be very sympathetic to him, and he saw this as his way out. I'll leave you to read the accident report, which is an astonishingly banal piece of writing, if ever I've come across it. There must be about 120 pages, all about how wonderfully serviceable the aircraft is, and half a paragraph on the mental health of the individual. So, the conclusions were obvious, but obviously no attention given to them. We know what the recommendations, which are now mandated, were after Germanwings, all of which make incredibly good sense. Their implementation and the finessing of it might be slightly more challenging. Probably foremost in all of that is peer support for pilots, something that I know many of you are involved in, and certainly something that we are. The return on investment is well demonstrated. Whatever you put in, and our German colleagues have been able to quantify this and say that approximately, and I think it's even more than this, for every euro you put in, you save 5 euros. So for those people who are responsible for commissioning these services, it must be very compelling. So peer support is important, and we'll touch on that in a while. The pre-employment psychological assessment, we've moved on from being a deep clinical assessment to really an interview with a pilot to see where their fit is. We all accept that a bush pilot operating in Botswana, in southern Africa, is going to be a completely different kind of pilot to somebody who's flying transatlantic, let's say, between Rome and New York in an A350. A different sort of person, different kind of background and character, and so on. We all now know that random drug and alcohol testing is being run through, and I know many pilots now who've been tested, and the system actually seems fairly fair and safe, even if some people, perhaps don't appreciate it's there. And very importantly, training mental health skills in assessment, particularly brief ones, for the medics who are involved in the assessments of pilots, and that's extensively what we do on one of the EASA courses in order to ensure that. So we need to perhaps just ground ourselves here for a moment and remind ourselves that we are working on a continuum here, and that is that mental ill health does not lead automatically to grave outcomes. In fact, the opposite. It might lead to time off, it might lead to a tired pilot, it might lead to a fretful pilot, but the idea that we as psychologists should primarily be on some kind of suicide watch is just not borne out at all. If we go back a little bit and we go to everything really up until the Germanwings crash in 2015, one of the things that we could say is that the attitudes toward mental well-being and mental ill health challenges amongst aircrew were actually quite punitive. I think most of us recognize it. Firstly, selection was about select out. That's quite an aggressive act. You are not fit for this particular job. Secondly, and there's a book and a film on this very topic, you've got to display the right stuff, okay? And the right stuff was very often depicted in terms of personality and so on. That the pilot was the cause of the problem, typically, so therefore there would be blame. The pilot was the insider threat who needed to be identified and removed from that environment. That there is a linear perception that if you follow operating procedures, a crash won't happen, which, as we know in modern human factors, is a little bit too linear for our liking. We prefer things a little bit more circular and a little bit more systemic. A blame culture, which leads to then litigation, and then we've got to ground this person. Okay, so that was largely the attitude before. And if we look nowadays at how teamwork really works, and what we're trying to encourage in aviation is that we're trying to screen people who may better not be suited here, because it's going to be costly in a number of different ways, not least to their training. And in fact, one of the biggest number of referrals that I get are from flight schools where young people who are starting their flight training display difficulties that are going to probably disrupt their future career. We've got crew resource management, we've got just culture, human factors, propagated in a much more positive way, peer support, mental well-being, and resilience. By the way, very briefly about resilience, which we can define in a moment. One of my concerns about it is that we are beginning to approach resilience in a way that is quite linear. If I teach you how to survive sleep difficulties, emotional distress, you won't have a problem. Well, I find that difficult as a conceptual idea, but certainly as a clinician. I worked with soldiers returning from Afghanistan, and many of them had been exposed to some pretty brutal and bad things, as you would imagine. And for many of them, they were able to endure that several times. But let's say the 8th time you shoot at somebody and kill them, something breaks inside of you. So the idea that resilience is going to always protect you is, I think, slightly naive. And I also think that we all display different kinds of resilience. If you ask me in my own personal life, I have quite a high threshold for emotional resilience, right? So, it takes quite a lot to make me feel churned by something. Obviously, I have human feelings, by the way, but I can go to a pretty high level. But ask my personal trainer about my resilience, and he'll tell you, you're weak. Right? Come on, Rob, you could have done 10 more of those. So the idea that resilience is this kind of single entity that you can package people up to, I think is naive. Okay? But I think that it does have its benefits and uses somewhere. So in the reality, we know that pilots are going to experience a number of different challenges. They're going to find themselves potentially grounded if they present with one of the more excluding mental health problems. Their training can give rise to a number of challenges that they may find difficult to bear. There will be problems that will manifest on the job itself, whether it's SIMS, whether it is relationship disruption and so on. Occupational ones with employers, which is quite a big one. It's resurfaced again recently as seniority seems to be knocked back, as working conditions have become less flexible. People who used to look after them in the airline have disappeared, left aviation and so on. We all have a personal life, so we'll have to add that to the equation as well. And of course, there are life events that can lead to quite organic, traumatic experiences. And, those also, that could be a loss, such as a bereavement. It could be the side effect of medication and so on. And until recently, we've not really understood properly where a pilot would take their problems. We know from research that there are a percentage of pilots who are currently flying who have not declared to the regulator that they are taking psychoactive medication. And there's not much that you can do unless you want to go and do random blood tests on people, which I would seriously discourage. That's not the way to approach the issue. But how do we bring them out from this kind of situation of shame, embarrassment, and fear? And these mental health issues are not just some theoretical issue. Notice that we know that they're going to have a secondary effect on behavior. So conflict on the flight deck or pre-flight deck or afterwards is more likely to arise. Task juggling is going to reduce. Concentration is typically impaired. Task completion could take longer. And we're potentially less patient with our clients or customers. All of these are challenges. Not all mental health issues are the same. They operate or we can think of them in terms of a typology. There are those that are just a temporary state. Who knows, maybe some of us arrived here today and we're feeling a little bit tired, maybe a bit flat, a bit down. Not me, by the way. But that's temporary. It's going to go away in that individual, as they have another coffee or sleep or something like that. Some of them could be more frequently occurring. There can be relapsing remitting, and that is typically anxiety and mood disorders. They come and they go, so they're not always present, and they're certainly not always present when you go and visit and attend to your doctor for your annual medical check. Some can be enduring and constant. Some can be incapacitating, and the second biggest number of referrals we get are for pilots who are flagged for having some kind of attentional problem, like ADHD, ADD, or perhaps on the autistic spectrum. So these are all very sensitive and very borderline, but they could be fairly constant, and they could get worse in stressful situations, which is why the regulator is very focused on these worldwide. The last one is the most important, and that is whatever the typology of the mental health problem, it is important that as long as the individual has insight that they have this problem, that is a protection, because they're much more likely to say, I'm tired, I have earache, and I want to be grounded, or whatever the case may be. The person who lacks insight, which could be somebody with ADHD, it could be somebody with bipolar disorder, that's the big threat, really, in aviation. So, in terms of the loss of medical license, whether temporarily or enduring, many of you will be familiar with this. Psychosis, schizophrenia, a history of that would typically be very excluding, with two exceptions. Postpartum depression leading to a psychotic episode, it's entirely possible. An individual giving birth could have a very dysregulated mood after so doing in the months afterwards, perhaps due to hormonal changes and so on. And the other is a psychosis that developed as a result of a drug reaction. And so it's important to be lenient to that individual, because the assumption is that they're going to recover. Major depression, personality disorders, which the FAA, the Americans, are much better at quantifying and stipulating what the criteria are. For the FAA, 2 overt acts of personality disorder, example, driving under the influence of alcohol, beating up your partner, that's the end of your license. Those are 2 overt acts of personality disorder that would lead to your Class 1 going. Obviously, the others are to do with dependency on substances, neurosis, which is a very high level of anxiety, attentional problems, progressive disease of the nervous system. Notice I skipped over the one about self-harm. 20 years ago, self-harm was an automatic disqualifier. These days, the regulators accept that a lot of young people may superficially cut themselves, maybe diet excessively and so on, as a form of self-harm, but they don't necessarily regard that as a suicidal act or parasuicidal acts, and so therefore they're going to be a lot more lenient about that. So, psychoactive medications, this has been something that we've been pushing and promoting, and the outcome is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I have worked with, I'm going to say, hundreds of pilots now on psychoactive medication. The 3 main drugs, I don't know if the same names would apply here or in other jurisdictions, escitalopram, citalopram, and sertraline. They have just added, 1 month ago, fluoxetine, old Prozac. The difference with Prozac or fluoxetine is that they want a 2-month grounding to see how the individual is adapting to it, just because it may be associated with more side effects. So all the time, the number of psychoactive medications is increasing, and I would say at any time it's possible that around between 1 to 3% of pilots who are flying may be on them, which is fantastic, because the goal is to get people to return to work, surely. So most of the problems that pilots are likely to confront may not necessarily require medication. They are typically living problems and challenges and so on, and here they are. And I think, the bottom line here is severe mental health problems affects absolutely the minority of pilots. It doesn't mean, that ones that are not severe are not important. As I've illustrated, they can impair concentration and so on. But in terms of actually having to be properly grounded with a question mark about returning to work, it's incredibly rare. I happen to be a family therapist as well, so I work a lot with pilot couples. How interesting is that for me? And I'm fascinated about the personal relationships that aircrew seem to enjoy or mess up, depending on where they are in their life trajectory. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe it's no more than anyone else, but the consequences are much greater if you're aircrew. And the most obvious is the frequent separations, the dysregulation over time and sleep can impede relationships. As we know, relationships should be a buffer against stress, so the moment it starts to wobble, there's an amplification effect in terms of safety. We know that separation and divorce is high, sometimes with long-haul pilots being away in a different time zone, with a crew they may not know, who may be quite young, and there's a sexualization that goes on there, and typically alcohol. So, there is room for trouble. And, I don't want to be judgmental. It's up to the pilot individually how they manage their life. But when it goes wrong, it's pretty spectacular in my experience. And one of the things that we don't know much about is what is the effect of micro-separations on couple relationships, which is another book that we're writing at the moment, which will probably come out later on this year, an area that I'm quite interested in. So we need to distinguish, and I'm mindful of time, of the difference between you're medically fit to fly, which is what a doctor determines, okay? Most of us in the room here don't have to do that, but as a psychologist supporting the doctors, your reports and assessments and information may be important and invaluable to them, but we do not declare somebody unfit. It's really important as a psychologist. We do not have that authority. And there is a difference between that and the individual feeling that they're mentally fit to operate. And that's what every pilot is taught. You need to be your own judge of your well-being. Are you rested? Are you able to concentrate? And so on. And those protections seem to work very well. You probably won't be able to see this slide, but what are all the constituent or components of being fit to fly? Obviously, they will be to do with concentration, eye-hand coordination, and so the list goes on, and I'm very happy to share these slides. In terms of assessments, there are 3 kinds of assessments that we as psychologists are likely to undertake. The first are performance-based ones, maximum ability ones. So this would be like in our school days doing IQ tests, but it would be the same in terms of the tracking tests that we use for selection typically. The mental health tests may be to do with personality, mental stability, and so on. And so we're moving toward a more kind of clinical focus. And then the rarer tests, but we do use those, are the neuropsychological ones, which help us to determine whether the individual, has any functional impairment that perhaps hasn't been detected in some other way. And it's not a requirement that psychologists are proficient in all 3 of these, or indeed in any of these, but I think, we do need to know what their uses are and also limitations. Where we frequently use neuropsychological tests, by the way, are around attentional problems, side effect of medication, return to work, TIA, transient ischemic attack, following trauma, until recently HIV, but HIV is no longer a disqualifying condition for your Class 1 medical. In fact, it is for the, you have to prove that there is some impairment to the individual, that there is some instability, let's say, to their immunity or drug adherence, medication adherence, and that there is no central nervous system involvement. So it's gone very lenient, which is probably very good news. Fatigue, I've never, until the last, I'd say 5 years, heard about burnout in pilots, and it's something that I keep hearing. And I don't know if it's just we've adopted a language and we keep saying the word burnout, meaning fatigue and irritation and so on, or maybe it really is something, that we have seen in other occupational sectors. So, very briefly, we're moving toward the end. Our focus, and I'll just pick up on a few of these, we need to start this in flight schools. I know many of us here represent, developed organizations, but flight school is where I see a lot of issues, and I think it would be useful for our involvement, including peer support at that level. We need to change and shift the culture of stigma. We need to up our skills in mental health and well-being. I know we're not all the same kind of psychologist, but simply your awareness that this doesn't look right or doesn't feel right, but I know a colleague who will be able to help me, a fellow psychologist, I think is fantastic. And I just want to pick up on the very last one. Here's a problem as a psychologist. I'm a bit behavioral these days as a psychologist. When somebody is fit to return to work, in most jurisdictions, they cannot enter the simulator to build confidence and proficiency, which would help them to get to work, because of insurance. Insurance will not allow you in the simulator if you're signed off sick. And so we're into this kind of cycle or circle which could be disruptive to the return to work process. So if we could get pilots into the simulators, that would be good. Very briefly, peer support. There are multiple iterations of it all over the world now. Unfortunately, perhaps where it's more needed, less so. So we see less of it in Africa, less in Far East Asia, and in the central Middle East, where it's probably needed because people perceive it with jeopardy or because the resources aren't there in the same way. And different versions of it, some of it is telephone-based, some of it is face-to-face, video FaceTime, text. So we've started working with a flight school in the US, and these are very young kids. Some of them are 18 to 21, 22, and we thought they're all going to just want to WhatsApp with each other. Turns out they don't want to do that at all. They want to make a call. They want to speak. So the idea that, the modern version of peer support should be let's type out messages is actually not borne out by the evidence that we have. Hey? Yeah. And when we think in terms of peer support, there are our peers at the top of our pyramid there, if we think in terms of the safety management system. But to have a fully functional peer support service, wherever you may be, you do need to start at the bottom here. You've got to think of quality assurance, GDPR, etc. Otherwise, data breaches are your biggest threat, so you've got to start there. You've got to have indemnity insurance. You've got to involve stakeholders, particularly the union, or it goes nowhere. There need to be escalation paths. What happens if a pilot feels concerned about someone, or you, as a mental health professional supporting them, have a concern about that individual? And obviously supervision and training are an important part of all of that. And here's an example of an escalation that we use. And the guidance that we follow for this is the British Medical Association guidance for the breach of confidentiality with doctors. It is a fantastic document, 6 pages. Anyone who wants the reference, I'll give it to you later on. British Medical Association guidance on breaking medical confidentiality. I believe it applies to us fantastically, and I won't go into the details, but if you have an escalation process, things work better. And we're working now very much on resilience there. It's just a graphic there to show, that there is a difference between something that is really urgent and pressing right at the bottom there. And let's think of it this way. Peer support is reactive, right? We don't go to a pilot and say, you need to talk to someone, typically. We wait for them to call us. Resilience is something different. Resilience is something we can share with people to give them a better understanding and better skills for dealing with mental health issues. And we're rolling this out at the moment. Virgin Atlantic are going to be our launch customer. It's a huge and complex online system. Pilots can access it from anywhere in the world. And it's all based around ICAO guidance and proficiencies and competencies and so on. Resilience, as I mentioned earlier on, I just want to be very careful about our definition of it, but importantly, it's about building adaptive capacity. It's not about preventing every problem, but it's giving people more tools so that problems can be ameliorated. And in that way, we can build a safer kind of a system. So we spend so many hours training pilots to overcome the startle response on the flight deck, right? Suddenly the undercarriage is not, functioning properly, etc., right? And yet we spend so little time talking to them about mental health and well-being. And that, to me, is the future. It doesn't need to be hours and hours and hours, but just flagging the issues is important. So in summary, mental health is preventable to a degree. We need to make sure that it is not delivered in a punitive, consequential way that would deter people from wanting to access it. We need to provide education, and where are the points of education? During recurrent training and so on. The idea that we should have whole special mental health modules, I'm not convinced about it. And mental health, as we've heard earlier on, is on the risk register. No organization worldwide now can turn around and say, well, we weren't told to do it. It's on the risk register, and no lawyer will let an airline get away with it. So that's not meant to scare us into setting it up. It means that simply because it doesn't exist in your jurisdiction doesn't mean that the airline won't be held culpable. It's absolutely out there. And there's lots that we as psychologists can do. So thank you for your attention.